Aldrics Quiet Grace. New York, 1922. Margaret Calloway found a dusty box of wartime letters in her grandmother's attic. Inside, she discovered an engagement ring, the same one James Calloway had given her before leaving for war. But James had been buried with it, hadn't he? Chapter 1. Dust and Whispers of the Past. The attic air hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of aged wood, mothballs, and forgotten memories. Sunlight, fractured by the grimy panes of a single dormer window, sliced through the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced like tiny, restless spirits. Margaret Calloway coughed, pulling the collar of her wool coat tighter around her neck, a futile defense against the pervasive chill that seeped from the old house's bones. Calloway House, her grandmother Eleanor's childhood home, stood on a quiet, tree-lined street in a once fashionable, now slightly faded, section of Brooklyn. It was a relic of a bygone era, a grand dame stubbornly clinging to its dignity amidst the encroaching modernity of 1922 New York. Margaret had always loved the house, with its sprawling rooms, intricate moldings, and the faint, lingering scent of rosewater that seemed woven into the very fabric of the walls, a testament to Eleanor's enduring presence, even 2 years after her passing. Eleanor, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering grace, a pillar of the Calloway family. Margaret had always felt a profound connection to her grandmother, a kinship that transcended generations. Eleanor had been a confidant, a source of wisdom, and the keeper of family secrets. Or so Margaret had thought. Today, Margaret was on a mission, a bittersweet pilgrimage to sort through Eleanor's remaining belongings. The house was to be sold, a practical necessity that felt like a betrayal. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of fabric, seemed to whisper of Eleanor's absence, a palpable ache in the heart of the house. The attic was the last frontier, a repository of cast-off treasures and discarded memories. Trunks overflowed with yellowed lace and moth-eaten furs, stacks of dusty books leaned precariously against the sloping eaves, and forgotten toys lay scattered like fallen soldiers on a long-ago battlefield. It was a tangible representation of the Calloway family history, a layered tapestry of lives lived and loves lost. Margaret knelt beside a particularly battered wooden chest, its brass hinges tarnished with age. The initials EC were elegantly carved into the lid, a familiar monogram that sent a pang of grief through her. This chest, she knew, contained Eleanor's personal effects, the items deemed too precious to discard, too painful to display. With trembling fingers, she lifted the heavy lid. The scent of lavender, Eleanor's favorite, wafted up, a ghostly embrace. Inside, nestled amongst layers of tissue paper, were stacks of letters, tied together with faded ribbons, a delicate porcelain doll with a chipped nose, and a small, velvet-lined box. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the box instantly. It was the one that had held her engagement ring, the one James had given her just days before he shipped out to France. The ring, a simple gold band, adorned with a single, flawless diamond, a symbol of their love, their future, their tragically abbreviated life together. She lifted the box, her fingers tracing the worn velvet. It felt impossibly light. Hesitantly, she opened it. The satin lining was pristine, the indentation where the ring had once rested still visible. But the box was empty. A wave of dizziness washed over Margaret. This couldn't be. James had been buried with the ring. She had insisted. It was her last, desperate act of love, a way to keep a piece of him with her, even in death. The official telegram from the War Department, the stark, black-bordered letter that had shattered her world, had confirmed it. Captain James Calloway, killed in action, buried with full military honors and his engagement ring. A cold dread began to creep into Margaret's heart. She reached for the stacks of letters, her hands shaking. These were the letters James had written to Eleanor during the war, a chronicle of his experiences, his hopes, his fears. Eleanor had treasured them, reading them countless times, keeping his memory alive. Margaret untied the ribbon on the top stack, her fingers fumbling with the knot. The paper was thin and brittle, The ink faded in places, but James's distinctive handwriting was unmistakable. She began to read, scanning the familiar phrases, the expressions of love and longing, the descriptions of the relentless rain and the ever-present mud of the trenches. She was on autopilot now, her brain barely registering the content. She was looking for something, not anything in particular. She was just trying to process what she had just done and what she would tell her family. And then she found it. A small, unassuming envelope tucked between two larger letters. It was addressed to Eleanor, but the handwriting was different, more delicate, more feminine. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the single sheet of paper within. The letter was dated just weeks before James's death. It was signed simply, A. The words were brief, cryptic, and devastating. Dearest Eleanor, the letter began, I understand your grief, believe I share it. But the truth must be known, I believe. James, he was not who you thought he was. The ring, it is not where you believe it to be. I have it. I will keep it safe. A reminder of the promises he made, the promises he broke. Meet me. I will share everything. Forgive me. Margaret stared at the letter, her mind reeling. The ring. James. The unknown A. The carefully chosen words hinted at a betrayal, a secret life, a hidden truth that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew about the man she had loved, the man she had mourned. The attic, once a sanctuary of memories, now felt like a trap, the dust-filled air suffocating. The whispers of the past had become a roar, a cacophony of unanswered questions and unsettling doubts. The empty ring box, the cryptic letter, the phantom A, it was all a puzzle, a mystery that demanded to be solved. Margaret closed her eyes, drawing a shaky breath. She had come to the attic seeking solace, a connection to her grandmother and the past. Instead, she had found a Pandora's box of secrets, a labyrinth of deceit that threatened to shatter her carefully constructed world. And she knew, with a growing certainty, that she could not rest until she had uncovered the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The ring was more than a ring now, it was a key to unlocking a past that refused to stay buried. The cool air of the attic no longer bothered her. Now it was the heat and the sudden thirst for the truth that was more concerning. Chapter 2. The unsent letter. The faded ink swam before Margaret's eyes as she reread the cryptic message from A. Each word was a shard of glass, piercing the carefully constructed image she had held of James, of their love, of their future that never was. The gentle, loving soldier she remembered, the man who had written her countless letters filled with poetry and promises, was now shrouded in a mist of doubt. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of her coat, a tangible weight against her heart. The attic, with its suffocating silence and the ghostly presence of Eleanor, felt unbearable. She needed air, space to think, to try to make sense of the impossible. Descending the narrow attic stairs, Margaret felt a disorientation, as if the solid ground beneath her feet had shifted. The familiar hallways of Calloway House, once a source of comfort, now seemed to whisper accusations, their shadows hinting at hidden truths. In the parlor, sunlight streamed through the lace-curtained windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the darkness she had found in the attic. The room was filled with Eleanor's belongings, carefully arranged, each object a testament to a life lived with quiet dignity. A mahogany writing desk stood in the corner, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. It was here that Eleanor had written her letters, received news from the war, and, presumably, corresponded with the mysterious A. Margaret sat at the desk, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface. She imagined Eleanor sitting here, penning her thoughts, her heart heavy with worry for her son, her future daughter-in-law. Had Eleanor known the truth about James? Had she deliberately concealed it, protecting Margaret from a pain she deemed too great to bear? Opening the top drawer of the desk, Margaret found a collection of stationery, pens, and sealing wax, all neatly organized. Beneath a stack of blank paper, she discovered another letter, this one tucked inside a plain envelope, unaddressed and unsent. With trembling hands, she pulled it out. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's, the script elegant and flowing, yet imbued with a palpable urgency. The date on the letter was just a few days after the one from A. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that I am gone, and the truth, however painful, must finally be revealed. The war has taken so much from us, stolen our loved ones, shattered our dreams. But it has also revealed hidden strengths, unexpected betrayals, and the enduring power of love in the face of unimaginable loss." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. Eleanor's words were a confession, a preamble to a revelation that she instinctively knew would change everything. "James, my beloved son, he was not the man we believed him to be. The war changed him, twisted him, exposed a darkness I had never suspected. He made promises, both to you and to another, promises that could not be reconciled. The ring, it is a symbol of those broken vows, a tangible reminder of the lies he told." A wave of nausea washed over Margaret. The confirmation of her worst fears, written in her grandmother's own hand, was almost unbearable. But there was more. "The woman who wrote to me, the one who calls herself A, she is not your enemy, Margaret. She is a victim, just as you are, caught in the web of James's deception. She possesses the ring, but she also possesses the key to understanding what truly happened in France. Find her, Margaret. Find her and learn the truth. Only then can you truly mourn James, and only then can you begin to heal." The letter ended abruptly, as if Eleanor had been interrupted, or perhaps overcome by emotion. Margaret sat there, stunned, the unsent letter clutched in her hand. Eleanor's words were a plea, a final act of love, a desperate attempt to guide her granddaughter through the labyrinth of deceit that James had created. But who was A? Where could she find her? The letter offered no clues, only the cryptic initial and the vague assertion that she held the key to unlocking the mystery. Margaret felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards James, towards the war that had taken him, towards the secrets that had poisoned their love. But beneath the anger, there was a flicker of determination. She would find A. She would uncover the truth, no matter how painful. She owed it to herself, to Eleanor, and even to the memory of the man James had once been. Standing up, she walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. The world seemed to move at a frantic pace, oblivious to the turmoil raging within her. She was alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, with only a handful of letters and a burning desire for answers to guide her. The unsent letter was a map, a fragile, incomplete guide to a hidden landscape of betrayal and heartbreak. But it was a start, and Margaret knew, with a growing certainty, that she would follow it, step by step, until she reached the truth, no matter where it might lead. The sounds of the city seemed to fade, leaving her only to hear the whispers from the war, all those years ago, and the lies it brought with them. Chapter 3. A face in the crowd. The city felt different now, alien. The familiar streets of Brooklyn, once a comforting backdrop to Margaret's life, now seemed to throb with a hidden pulse, a secret rhythm that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. Every face in the crowd, every fleeting glance, held the potential to be A, the mysterious woman who held the key to James's betrayal. Margaret had spent the past few days poring over Eleanor's belongings, searching for any clue, any hint that might lead her to the elusive A. She had meticulously examined every letter, every photograph, every scrap of paper in the Calloway house, but found nothing. Remained a ghost, a whisper in the wind. The frustration was almost unbearable. Margaret felt like she was chasing shadows, grasping at straws in a desperate attempt to make sense of the impossible. The image of James, once so clear and vivid, was now blurred, distorted by the revelation of his deceit. She struggled to reconcile the loving, devoted fiancé she remembered with the man described in Eleanor's and A's letters. Driven by a need to escape the suffocating confines of Calloway House, Margaret decided to visit the one place that still held a tangible connection to James, the small, unassuming jewelry shop where he had purchased her engagement ring. Perhaps, she reasoned, the jeweler might remember something, some detail that could shed light on James's secret life. The shop, nestled on a quiet side street in Lower Manhattan, was much as she remembered it, a haven of old-world charm, with its velvet-lined display cases and the faint scent of silver polish. Mr. Abernathy, the jeweler, a kindly old man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice raspy with age, "it's been a long time. How lovely to see you." Margaret forced a smile, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken grief. "Mr. Abernathy, it's good to see you too. I was hoping you might be able to help me with something." She explained her situation, carefully omitting the details of James's betrayal, focusing instead on the missing ring and her desire to find it. Mr. Abernathy listened patiently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The ring," he said, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "Yes, I remember it well. A beautiful piece, a classic design. Captain Calloway was very particular. He wanted something special, something that would reflect his love for you." Margaret felt a pang of sadness at his words. Even in his deception, James had maintained a facade of devotion, a cruel irony that made the betrayal even more painful. "Do you remember anything else about him, Mr. Abernathy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything unusual?" Mr. Abernathy hesitated, his eyes searching her face. "He came in a few times," he finally said, "always alone. But there was one time, I recall him speaking to someone outside the shop. A woman." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "A woman? Do you remember what she looked like?" Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "It was a while ago, Miss Calloway, and I only saw her from a distance, but I remember she was striking. Tall, elegant, with dark hair. She was wearing a rather distinctive coat, a deep emerald green, with a fur collar. An emerald green coat." The detail, seemingly insignificant, resonated with Margaret. It was a tangible clue, a thread to follow in the labyrinth of her search. Did you hear what they were talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Mr. Abernathy shook his head again. "No, Miss Calloway. I didn't want to pry, but they seemed to be arguing. Their voices were raised, although I couldn't make out the words." An argument. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The encounter between James and the woman in the green coat, witnessed by Mr. Abernathy, suggested a relationship far more complex than a casual acquaintance. Margaret thanked Mr. Abernathy for his help, her mind racing. She had a description, however vague, of the woman she was seeking. A tall, elegant woman with dark hair, who owned a distinctive emerald green coat. It wasn't much, but it was a starting point. As she stepped back out onto the bustling street, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. The city, once a source of anonymity and indifference, now seemed to hold a glimmer of hope. Somewhere, amidst the millions of faces that thronged the streets of New York, was the woman who held the key to James's secrets. And Margaret was determined to find her. She began her search, methodically, painstakingly, visiting the places James had frequented, the restaurants, the theaters, the social clubs he had mentioned in his letters. She showed Mr. Abernathy's description to anyone who might have known James, hoping for a spark of recognition, a lead that might guide her to A. Days turned into weeks, and still, A remained elusive. Margaret's hope began to dwindle, replaced by a gnawing sense of despair. She was starting to believe that she was chasing a phantom, a figment of her imagination. Then, one rainy afternoon, as she was walking through Grand Central Terminal, a flash of green caught her eye. A woman, tall and elegant, with dark hair pulled back in a chignon, was standing near the information booth, her back to Margaret. She was wearing a deep emerald green coat, with a fur collar. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. Could it be her? Could this be A? She hesitated, her mind racing. What should she say? How should she approach her? Taking a deep breath, Margaret started towards the woman, her steps faltering. As she drew closer, she saw the woman turn, her face coming into view. It was not A. The face in the crowd was only another possibility, only to find that the search was far from over. Chapter 4. Echoes of Amiens. The disappointment was crushing. The woman in Grand Central, with her emerald green coat and dark hair, had been a false lead, a mirage in the desert of Margaret's search. Days turned into weeks, and the trail grew colder. Margaret felt like she was back at square one, chasing a ghost through the labyrinthine streets of New York. The weight of the unanswered questions pressed down on her, a constant burden that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. She found herself withdrawing from her friends and family, unable to share the turmoil raging within her. The vibrant social life she had once enjoyed now felt hollow, a meaningless charade. One evening, while sorting through another box of Eleanor's belongings, Margaret stumbled upon a small, leather-bound journal. It was Eleanor's diary, a chronicle of her daily life, her thoughts, her fears. Flipping through the pages, Margaret's eye was drawn to a series of entries from 1918, the year James had been killed. Eleanor's handwriting, usually so elegant and controlled, was shaky and uneven in these entries, reflecting the anxiety and grief she had experienced during the war. She wrote of her constant worry for James, her prayers for a safe return, and her desperate attempts to glean any news from the front. And then Margaret found it, a single, cryptic entry, dated just a few weeks before James's death, received another letter from A. She is in Amiens. Says she has seen James. Says he is changed, distant, haunted. She fears for him. She fears for us all.
Amiens.
The name struck a chord. It was a city in northern France, a major hub for British and Allied forces during the war. James had mentioned Amiens in his letters, describing it as a bustling, chaotic place, filled with soldiers, nurses, and the wounded. Margaret's heart quickened. This was a new lead, a concrete connection between A and James. If A had been in Amiens, perhaps she had worked there, perhaps she had known someone who had known James. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She would go to the local library, to research Amiens, to learn everything she could about the city and its role in the war. She spent hours poring over maps, historical accounts, and memoirs, immersing herself in the world of wartime France. She discovered that Amiens had been a major medical center, with numerous hospitals and convalescent homes established to care for the wounded. It had also been a hub for volunteer organizations, such as the Red Cross and the YMCA, which provided support services to the troops. A thought struck Margaret. Perhaps they had been a nurse or a volunteer worker stationed in Amiens. It would explain her proximity to James, her ability to observe him, to witness the changes that Eleanor had described in her diary. Returning to Calloway House, Margaret began a new search, this time focusing on organizations that had operated in Amiens during the war. She wrote letters to the Red Cross, the YMCA, and other charitable groups, requesting any information they might have on women who had served in Amiens in 1918. The responses were slow in coming, and most were discouraging. Records were incomplete. Many had been lost or destroyed in the chaos of the war. Margaret's hope began to fade once again. Then one morning, a letter arrived from the American Red Cross. It contained a list of women who had served as nurses in Amiens during the relevant period. Margaret scanned the names, her heart pounding with anticipation. And there it was, Annalise Dubois, volunteer nurse. Amiens, 1917-1918. Annalise Dubois. The name resonated, a whisper from the past. Could this be A? The pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit. Annalise, a volunteer nurse, stationed in Amiens during the time James was there. The letter provided a last known address for Annalise Dubois, a small town in upstate New York. It was a long shot, but Margaret knew she had to follow it. She packed a small bag, informed her family that she was taking a short trip, and boarded a train heading north. As the train rattled through the countryside, Margaret gazed out the window, her mind filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She was finally closing in on A, the woman who held the key to James's secrets. But what would she find? What truths would be revealed? The journey was long and arduous, but Margaret's determination never wavered. She was driven by a need to understand, to make sense of the shattered fragments of her past. The echoes of Amiens, the whispers of betrayal and loss, were guiding her, leading her towards a confrontation with the truth, a truth that had been buried for far too long. The rumble of the train was the perfect ambience, as she would soon be faced with reality, face to face. Chapter 5. The Serpent's Tooth. The town of Oakhaven, nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, was a world away from the bustling streets of Brooklyn. It was a quiet, sleepy place, where life moved at a slower pace, and the scars of the war seemed distant and faint. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and damp earth, a stark contrast to the smoky, congested air of the city. Margaret found the address listed for Annalise Dubois with relative ease. It was a small, unassuming cottage, set back from the road, surrounded by a garden overgrown with wildflowers. A weathered wooden sign hung above the door, bearing the name A. Dubois Herbalist. An herbalist. The revelation was unexpected. Margaret had imagined A as a nurse, a caregiver, a woman immersed in the world of medicine. The image of her as an herbalist, a purveyor of natural remedies, seemed incongruous with the image of the woman who had written the cryptic letter, the woman who had witnessed James's descent into darkness. Taking a deep breath, Margaret approached the cottage, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the weathered wood. A moment of silence followed, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Margaret found herself face to face with a woman who could only be Annalise Dubois. She was older than Margaret had expected, perhaps in her late 50s, but she possessed the same striking elegance that Mr. Abernathy had described. Her dark hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a severe bun, accentuating her high cheekbones and piercing blue eyes. She was wearing a simple, homespun dress, and a silver pendant, shaped like a serpent coiled around a staff, hung around her neck. "Miss Dubois?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. The woman nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes." "Can I help you?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how to begin. "My name is Margaret Calloway. I believe you knew my fiancé, James Calloway, during the war." Annalise's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "James Calloway," she repeated, her voice soft, tinged with a faint French accent. "Yes, I knew him. It has been a long time." "I found a letter," Margaret continued, "a letter you wrote to my grandmother, Eleanor Calloway. You signed it simply, Annalise's expression hardened, her eyes clouding with a mixture of sadness and suspicion. "So, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that he wasn't the man I thought he was," Margaret said, her voice choked with emotion. "I know that he made promises to me that he couldn't keep. I know that you have the ring, the engagement ring he gave me." Annalise stepped back, inviting Margaret into the cottage. The interior was dimly lit, filled with the scent of dried herbs and wildflowers. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars and bottles containing various plants and tinctures. A small, wood-burning stove provided a meager source of heat. "Please sit down," Annalise said, gesturing towards a worn armchair. Margaret sat, her gaze fixed on Annalise. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. "I loved James," Annalise finally said, her voice breaking. "I loved him with all my heart. But the war, it changed him. It broke him. He became a different person, a stranger." She recounted her story, her voice filled with a mixture of pain and regret. She had met James in Amiens, where she was working as a volunteer nurse. He had been wounded, a shrapnel injury to his leg, and she had cared for him, tending to his physical and emotional wounds. They had fallen in love, a desperate, passionate love born amidst the chaos and destruction of war. "He promised to marry me," Annalise said, her eyes welling with tears. "He gave me a ring, a beautiful emerald, a symbol of his devotion. But then he changed. He became distant, withdrawn, haunted by the horrors he had seen." Margaret listened, her heart aching for Annalise, for the shared pain that bound them together. She understood now, the depth of James's betrayal, the impossible choices he had faced. "He told me about you," Annalise continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me about his engagement, about his promise to return to you. He was torn, Margaret. Torn between his love for me and his duty to you. The serpent pendant around Annalise's neck seemed to glint in the dim light, a symbol of the duality of James's nature, the serpent's tooth of betrayal that had poisoned both their lives. He asked me to keep the ring, Annalise said, her voice trembling. My ring. He said it was a reminder of our love, a reminder of his sin and my love. I have it here, with your ring as well. He came to me one last time. He was different. He handed me your ring and he apologized. He said it was over and that he did it all to protect me. The air in the cottage was thick with emotion, the weight of shared grief and shattered dreams. Margaret knew that she was facing the hard truth that Eleanor wanted her to. But this ending wasn't the end. Where was James buried? Chapter 6. The Midnight Confession. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating like the scent of the dried herbs that permeated Annalise's cottage. Margaret stared at the woman, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the broken, tormented James with the man she thought she knew. The emerald ring, the symbol of his love for Annalise, and her own diamond, now both in Annalise's possession, were tangible proof of his duplicity. He gave you my ring? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question a painful echo of the one she had asked Mr. Abernathy weeks ago. Annalise nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored Margaret's own. He came to me the night before he was sent back to the front. He was different, distant, almost as if he knew what was coming. She walked to a small, wooden chest tucked in a corner of the room and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay 2 rings, Margaret's simple gold band with its single diamond and a stunning emerald, set in an intricate, antique setting. The contrast between the 2 rings was striking, a visual representation of the 2 lives James had attempted to lead. Annalise picked up Margaret's ring, holding it out to her. He said he wanted you to have it back. He said he was sorry. For everything. Margaret reached out, her fingers trembling, and took the ring. It felt cold and unfamiliar, a foreign object that no longer held the promise of a shared future. The diamond, once a symbol of hope and unwavering love, now seemed to mock her, a reminder of the illusion she had clung to for so long. But the telegram, Margaret stammered, the official report, it said he was buried with the ring. I insisted. Annalise's expression softened, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. The war, it was a time of chaos, Margaret. Mistakes were made. Records were lost. Lies were told to protect the living, to spare them further pain. She paused, her gaze drifting towards the window, as if looking back at a past that refused to stay buried. The night James came to me, he told me he had made arrangements. He had spoken to a chaplain, a friend, someone he trusted. He had given him instructions to ensure that the report would state that he was buried with your ring. Margaret's mind reeled. James had orchestrated his own deception, even in death. He had manipulated the system, the military bureaucracy, to protect her, to shield her from the truth of his betrayal. But why? He said it was the only way to protect you, Annalise continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He knew that if the truth came out, it would destroy you. He wanted you to remember him as the man you loved, not the man he had become. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Margaret. Anger, grief, resentment, and a strange, unexpected sense of pity. James had been a victim of the war, just as she and Annalise were. He had been broken, twisted, forced to make impossible choices in a world gone mad. But why did he come to you? Margaret asked, her voice cracking. Why did he give you both rings? Why didn't he just disappear? Annalise closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He wanted forgiveness, I think. He wanted to confess, to unburden himself. He knew he couldn't go back to you, not after what he had done. But he couldn't leave without making amends, in his own way. The midnight confession, the exchange of rings, the desperate attempt to find redemption, it was a tragic, heartbreaking scene, a testament to the enduring power of love and the devastating consequences of war. He told me he loved me, Annalise whispered, her voice filled with a pain that transcended time. But he also said he loved you. He was trapped, Margaret. Trapped between two worlds, two loves, two impossible choices. Margaret felt a surge of empathy for Annalise, for the woman who had shared James's heart, who had suffered the same betrayal, the same loss. They were bound together by a shared tragedy, by the ghost of a man who had loved them both, in his own flawed, broken way. But there was still one unanswered question, a nagging doubt that lingered in Margaret's mind. If he wasn't buried with the ring, she asked, her voice trembling, then where is he buried? Where is James? The silence that question gave was overwhelming. The two sat, just staring at each other. Chapter 7. Beneath the Lies. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, a stark reminder of the gaping hole in the narrative of James's death. Annalise looked away, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the wood-burning stove, her silence more telling than any words. Margaret felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The carefully constructed facade of James's heroic death, the image she had clung to for years, was crumbling before her eyes. Beneath the lies, beneath the deception, lay a truth that was far more complex, far more painful. Annalise, Margaret pleaded, her voice trembling, please. You must know. Where is he buried? Annalise finally turned back to face her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. I don't know the exact location, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I know he wasn't buried in France. Not in the military cemetery, as the official report stated. Margaret's mind reeled. This was a new layer of deception, a twist she had not anticipated. If James wasn't buried in France, then where was he? He told me he had made arrangements, Annalise continued, her voice hesitant, as if she were reliving a painful memory. He had spoken to his chaplain, the one he trusted. He had given him instructions to have his body sent back to America, to be buried in a place where he could find peace. A place where he could find peace. The words resonated with Margaret, a glimmer of understanding in the darkness. James, haunted by the horrors of war, had sought a final resting place, a sanctuary from the memories that tormented him. But where? Margaret pressed, her voice urgent. Did he say where in America? Annalise shook her head. No. He only said it was a place he had known as a child. A place of innocence. Before the war. A place of innocence. Before the war. Margaret's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information. James had grown up in New York, in Calloway House, the same house where she had discovered the letters, the ring, the unraveling of his secrets. Could it be possible? Could James be buried somewhere close to home? Did he mention anything about his family? Margaret asked, her voice hopeful. A family plot? A cemetery he might have visited as a child? Annalise hesitated, her brow furrowed in concentration. He spoke of his mother often, she said, her voice soft. He loved her dearly. She died when he was young, I believe. He said he used to visit her grave. He found comfort there. His mother's grave. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. James, seeking solace, seeking a connection to a time before the war, had chosen to be buried near his mother. Margaret felt a surge of determination. She had to find James's mother's grave. It was the only lead she had, the only way to uncover the final resting place of the man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her, the man who had been a victim of a war that had shattered so many lives. Annalise, Margaret said, her voice firm, I need to find his mother's grave. Do you know where she is buried? Annalise shook her head again. I don't. I only know he said it was in New York. Somewhere quiet. Peaceful. Margaret stood up, her legs feeling shaky. Thank you, Annalise, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you for telling me the truth. For everything. Annalise reached out and took Margaret's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. The truth, it is a heavy burden, Margaret, she said, her eyes filled with a wisdom born of pain. But it is also a path to healing, to freedom. Margaret nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the revelations, but also with a newfound sense of purpose. She had a mission now, a quest to find James's final resting place, to uncover the last secret that lay buried beneath the lies. As she left Annalise's cottage, the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Margaret felt a sense of peace, a quiet resolve that had been absent for so long. The journey ahead would be difficult, she knew, but she was no longer chasing shadows. She was following a trail, a path that led to the truth, to the final resting place of the man she had loved, the man who had been lost, not only to the war, but to himself. She was no longer certain of what awaited her, but her resolve was strong. She would find his final resting place. Chapter 8. The Stolen Promise. The return journey to New York was filled with a restless anticipation. Margaret's mind raced, replaying every conversation with Annalise, every detail gleaned from Eleanor's diary and James's letters. The image of James, once so clear, was now fragmented, a mosaic of conflicting truths and half-lies. He was a lover, a betrayer, a victim, a soldier haunted by the ghosts of war. Her focus narrowed to a single, overriding objective, finding James's mother's grave. It was the key, she believed, to unlocking the final mystery, to finding James's true resting place. Back in Brooklyn, Margaret immediately began her search. She started with Calloway House, poring over old family records, searching for any mention of James's mother, Eleanor's predecessor, the first Mrs. Calloway. She discovered that James's mother's name was Eliza. Eliza Calloway, a woman who had died young, leaving behind a grieving husband and a young son. Margaret found a faded photograph of Eliza, a delicate, ethereal beauty with sad eyes and a gentle smile. She felt a pang of sympathy for this woman, whose life had been cut short, whose son had been lost to the ravages of war. The family records indicated that Eliza was buried in Greenwood Cemetery, a vast, sprawling necropolis in Brooklyn, a city of the dead that rivaled the city of the living in its size and complexity. The next morning, Margaret set out for Greenwood, her heart heavy with a mixture of trepidation and determination. The cemetery was a labyrinth of winding paths, towering monuments, and ancient trees, a silent testament to the countless lives that had passed through the city's gates. She spent hours wandering through the seemingly endless rows of headstones, searching for the name Eliza Calloway. The task seemed overwhelming, a needle in a haystack, but Margaret refused to give up. She clung to the hope that somewhere, amidst the thousands of graves, lay the answer to her quest. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Margaret stumbled upon a section of the cemetery that seemed older, more neglected than the others. The headstones here were weathered and worn, their inscriptions barely legible. And then she saw it, a small, unassuming headstone, partially obscured by overgrown ivy. The inscription was faint, but Margaret could just make out the words, Eliza Calloway, beloved wife and mother, 1870-1902. Margaret knelt beside the grave, her heart pounding in her chest. She had found her, James's mother, the woman whose memory had drawn him back from the battlefields of France. She carefully cleared away the ivy, revealing the full inscription. Beneath Eliza's name, there was a small, empty space, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. And then Margaret understood. James had intended to be buried here, beside his mother, in this quiet, forgotten corner of the cemetery. He had sought a return to innocence, a reunion with the woman who had loved him unconditionally, before the war had changed him, before the lies had begun. But something had gone wrong. The empty space beneath Eliza's name was a testament to a stolen promise, a plan that had been thwarted. Margaret felt a surge of frustration, a renewed sense of urgency. She had found Eliza's grave, but James was still missing. Where was he? Who had prevented him from being buried here? Standing up, she looked around, her gaze sweeping across the surrounding graves. And then she noticed something. A few feet away from Eliza's headstone, there was another grave, a newer one, marked by a simple, unadorned cross. There was no name on the cross, no inscription, only a small, metal plaque affixed to the base. Margaret approached the grave, her heart pounding with a premonition, a sense of impending revelation. She knelt down and examined the plaque. It was a military marker bearing the insignia of the United States Army. And beneath the insignia, there were 2 words, engraved in simple, block letters, "Unknown Soldier." Margaret stared at the plaque, her mind reeling. An unknown soldier, buried near Eliza Calloway. Could it be? Could this be James? A wave of dizziness washed over her. The pieces of the puzzle, the fragmented clues, the whispered secrets, all seemed to converge on this one, unmarked grave. James, seeking anonymity, seeking to escape the burden of his identity, had chosen to be buried as an unknown soldier, a nameless casualty of a war that had claimed so many lives. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, a mixture of grief, relief, and a profound sense of loss. She had found him, but not in the way she had expected. He was not a hero, not a celebrated captain, but a nameless soldier, a symbol of the countless men who had been lost, forgotten, swallowed up by the machinery of war. The stolen promise had been kept, in a way, just not how anyone had imagined it. Chapter 9. Across the sea, a shadow. The discovery of the unknown soldier grave, so close to Eliza Calloway's, was a revelation, a gut-wrenching confirmation of Margaret's deepest suspicions. Yet it also raised more questions. If James had orchestrated his burial as an unknown soldier, who had facilitated it? Who had known his true identity and kept it secret? The chaplain. The name echoed in Margaret's mind, the one Annalise had mentioned, the trusted friend to whom James had confided his final wishes. He was the key, the missing link in the chain of events. Margaret returned to Calloway House, determined to find any information she could about this mysterious chaplain. She searched through James's letters again, this time focusing on any mentions of religious figures, chaplains, or spiritual advisors. She found a few references scattered throughout his correspondence. James had written about attending services, seeking solace in prayer, and finding comfort in the words of a particular chaplain, a man he referred to simply as Father Michael. Father Michael. The name was a starting point, a thread to follow. Margaret decided to contact the War Department, hoping they might have records of chaplains who had served with James's regiment. The process was slow and frustrating, bureaucratic hurdles and endless paperwork delaying her progress. Weeks turned into months, and still, she had no concrete information. Then, one morning, a letter arrived from the War Department. It contained a list of chaplains who had served with James's unit, along with their last known contact information. And there it was. Father Michael O'Connell. Discharged from service, 1919. Current address, St. Patrick's Church, Dublin, Ireland. Dublin, Ireland. The revelation was unexpected. Margaret had assumed the chaplain would be American like James. The fact that he was Irish and had returned to his home country after the war added another layer of complexity to her search. But Margaret was undeterred. She had come too far, uncovered too many secrets, to give up now. She made a decision. She would travel to Ireland. She would find Father Michael O'Connell and uncover the final truth about James's death and burial. The journey across the Atlantic was long and arduous, a stark reminder of the vast distance that had separated James from his home, from his loved ones. Margaret gazed out at the endless expanse of the ocean, her mind filled with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Arriving in Dublin, Margaret felt a sense of displacement, a stranger in a foreign land. The city was a vibrant tapestry of history and culture, but it also held a sense of melancholy, a lingering sadness that seemed to echo the aftermath of war. She found St. Patrick's Church, a grand, imposing structure in the heart of the city. She inquired about Father Michael O'Connell, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The parish priest, a kindly old man with a gentle smile, informed her that Father O'Connell was no longer at St. Patrick's. He had retired a few years earlier and was now living in a small village on the west coast of Ireland. Margaret's heart sank. Another obstacle, another detour in her quest. But she refused to be discouraged. She obtained directions to the village and set out once again, traveling by train and bus across the rugged Irish countryside. The village, when she finally arrived, was a picturesque cluster of whitewashed cottages, perched on a cliff overlooking the wild Atlantic Ocean. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. She found Father O'Connell's cottage, a small, unassuming dwelling at the edge of the village. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. A moment of silence followed, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Margaret found herself face to face with an elderly man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes a piercing blue. "Father O'Connell?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. The man nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes. Can I help you?" The stage was set. Margaret was a long way from home, following the trail of the man she was once set to marry. Chapter 10. The Hospital of Lost Souls. "My name is Margaret Calloway," she began, her voice steadier than she expected, the rehearsed words flowing out in a rush. "I believe you knew my fiancé, Captain James Calloway, during the war." Father O'Connell's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense, as if searching for some hidden truth in her features. "James Calloway," he repeated, his voice a low rumble, tinged with a faint Irish brogue. "Yes, I knew him. He was a good man. A brave soldier." A wave of relief washed over Margaret. She had found him. The man who held the final key to James's secrets. I know about the arrangements he made," Margaret continued, her voice trembling slightly. "About his wish to be buried as an unknown soldier." Father O'Connell's expression softened, a glimmer of sadness in his eyes. He stepped back, inviting her into the cottage. The interior was simple and sparsely furnished, a stark contrast to the grand rectory she had imagined. A small fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. "Please sit down, Miss Calloway," he said, gesturing towards a worn armchair. Margaret sat, her gaze fixed on Father O'Connell. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. "James, he was a troubled soul," Father O'Connell finally said, his voice filled with a mixture of compassion and regret. "The war, it did terrible things to him. To all of us." He recounted his experiences with James, his voice hesitant at first, then gaining strength as he delved into the painful memories. He had met James in France at a field hospital near Amiens, where he was serving as a chaplain. He was wounded, Father O'Connell said, not just physically, but emotionally. He had seen too much death, too much suffering. He was haunted by the things he had done, the things he had witnessed. Margaret listened, her heart aching for James, for the young man she had loved, the man who had been so irrevocably damaged by the war. "He came to me seeking solace," Father O'Connell continued, "seeking forgiveness. He confessed his sins, his doubts, his fears. He told me about the two women in his life." Margaret felt a pang of empathy for Father O'Connell, for the burden he had carried, the secrets he had kept for so long. "He made me promise," Father O'Connell said, his voice trembling, "to help him disappear. To ensure that he would be buried as an unknown soldier, with no name, no recognition. He wanted to escape the burden of his identity, the weight of his past." Margaret understood now, the depth of James's despair, his desperate desire to find peace, to escape the horrors that haunted him. "He gave me a letter," Father O'Connell said, "a letter to be delivered to his family, explaining his wishes. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to reveal the truth, to shatter the illusion of his heroic death." He walked to a small desk in the corner of the room and opened a drawer. He pulled out a faded, yellowed envelope, its edges frayed and worn. He handed it to Margaret. "This is the letter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have kept it all these years, unable to destroy it, unable to deliver it." Margaret took the letter, her hands trembling. It was addressed to Eleanor Calloway, in James's familiar handwriting. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The final confession, the ultimate truth about James's fate. It wasn't easy, Father O'Connell added. Arranging everything. Getting the right contacts, the right paperwork. I felt bad for the deception, but I knew it was important to do right by James. He was a good man, and the war turned him inside out. Margaret remained in her seat, just staring at the letter and the man who had become a keeper of James' secrets. The weight of the moment had settled on her. Chapter 11. The Price of Silence. Margaret stared at the letter, the faded ink of James's handwriting a tangible link to the past, to the man she had loved and lost. Her fingers traced the contours of the envelope, feeling the weight of the unspoken words, the secrets it contained. Father O'Connell, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Why didn't you send it? Why did you keep it all these years? The old priest sighed, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if looking back at a past that refused to stay buried. I wrestled with my conscience, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. I knew James's wishes, his desire to disappear, to be forgotten. But I also knew the pain his silence would cause, the unanswered questions that would haunt his loved ones. He turned back to face Margaret, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I made a promise, he said, a promise to a dying man. But I also had a duty to the truth, to the living. I was torn, Margaret. Torn between two obligations, two conflicting loyalties. Margaret understood his dilemma, the impossible choice he had faced. He had been caught in the crossfire of James's deception, burdened with a secret that had weighed heavily on his soul. In the end, Father O'Connell continued, I chose silence. I convinced myself that it was the lesser of two evils, that it was better to let James rest in peace, to let his family believe in his heroic death, than to reveal the truth, to shatter their illusions. He paused, his gaze fixed on Margaret, as if seeking her forgiveness, her understanding. But I was wrong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence, it has a price. It festers, it grows, it poisons the soul. I have carried this burden for too long, Margaret. It is time for the truth to be known. Margaret nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She opened the letter, her hands shaking, and began to read. James's words, written in the cramped, hurried script of a man facing his own mortality, were a confession, a plea for forgiveness, a desperate attempt to make sense of the chaos and destruction that had consumed his life. He wrote of his love for Margaret, of his unwavering devotion, of his dreams of a future that would never be. He wrote of his love for Annalise, of the passion that had ignited in the crucible of war, of the impossible choice he had been forced to make. He wrote of the horrors he had witnessed, the atrocities he had committed, the guilt that had gnawed at his soul. He wrote of his descent into darkness, his inability to reconcile the man he had become with the man he once was. He wrote of his decision to disappear, to become an unknown soldier, to escape the burden of his identity, the weight of his past. He wrote of his hope that Margaret would find peace, that she would remember him, not as the hero he was supposed to be, but as the flawed, broken man he truly was. The letter ended with a simple, heartfelt plea. Forgive me, Margaret. Forgive me for everything. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she finished reading. The letter was a window into James's soul, a testament to the devastating impact of war, the enduring power of love, and the crushing weight of guilt. He was a good man, Margaret, Father O'Connell said, his voice soft, compassionate. He was a victim of circumstances, a casualty of a war that destroyed so many lives. He deserves to be remembered, not for his lies, but for his struggle, for his humanity. Margaret nodded, her heart aching for James, for the young man she had loved, the man who had been lost, not only to the war, but to himself. She had found the truth, the painful, heartbreaking truth. But she had also found a measure of peace, a sense of closure that had eluded her for so long. The price of silence had been high, but the truth, finally revealed, offered a path to healing, to acceptance, to a future free from the shadows of the past. She had carried the weight long enough. Chapter 12. A gathering storm. The journey back to America felt different. The weight of James's letter, tucked safely in her bag, was a constant reminder of the truth she had uncovered, the secrets she now carried. The vast expanse of the ocean, once a symbol of separation and uncertainty, now seemed to reflect the turbulent emotions swirling within her: grief, relief, anger, and a profound sense of loss. Margaret knew that her journey was far from over. She had found James, in a way, but she still had to confront the legacy of his deception, the impact it had had on her family, on her own life. She also had to decide what to do with the information she had uncovered, whether to reveal the truth to the world or to keep it buried, protecting the illusion of James's heroic death. Arriving back in New York, Margaret felt a sense of displacement, as if she were returning to a world that was both familiar and alien. Calloway House, once a sanctuary of memories, now seemed to echo with the whispers of betrayal and loss. She knew she couldn't face her family, not yet. She needed time to process her emotions, to decide on a course of action. She decided to visit Greenwood Cemetery again, to stand before the unmarked grave of the unknown soldier, to connect with the man James had become. The cemetery was shrouded in a thick fog, the air heavy with moisture, the atmosphere mirroring the somber mood that had settled over Margaret. She found the grave easily, the simple cross a stark contrast to the elaborate monuments that surrounded it. She knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the cold metal of the plaque. "James," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "I found you. I know the truth." She spent hours there, talking to James, pouring out her heart, sharing her grief, her anger, her confusion. She told him about Annalise, about Father O'Connell, about the letter he had written, the secrets he had kept. As she spoke, a storm began to gather, the wind whipping through the trees, the sky darkening with ominous clouds. The atmosphere was charged with electricity, reflecting the turmoil raging within Margaret. She felt a strange sense of connection to James, a feeling that transcended the physical realm. She imagined him there, beside her, listening to her words, offering her solace, understanding. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning illuminated the cemetery, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Margaret startled, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw it. Standing a few feet away, partially obscured by the fog, was a figure. A man, tall and slender, his face hidden in shadow. He was wearing a long coat, his collar turned up against the wind. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Who was this man? Was he watching her? She stood up, her legs trembling, and took a step towards him. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. He simply stood there, motionless, his gaze fixed on Margaret. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cemetery, and for a brief moment, Margaret saw his face. It was a face she recognized, a face that sent a shiver of fear down her spine. It was a face from her past that never left. It couldn't be. It was. The figure was that of her own brother, Richard. Chapter 13. The Ghost of Ypres. The recognition hit Margaret like a physical blow. Richard, her own brother, standing there, in the fog-shrouded cemetery, his face a mask of what? Grief? Guilt? Suspicion? Richard? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper, the name a question, an accusation, a plea for understanding. He didn't answer, didn't move. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, his presence a chilling reminder of the family ties that bound them, the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary lives. Margaret took another step towards him, her mind racing, trying to make sense of his presence. Why was he here? Had he known all along about James? Had he been involved in the deception? "Richard," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, fueled by a mixture of fear and anger. "What are you doing here?" He finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, barely audible above the wind. I had to see for myself." "See what?" Margaret demanded, her voice trembling. "See the grave of the unknown soldier? See the grave of the man you knew as James?" Richard flinched, as if struck by her words. He took a step back, his hands clenching into fists. I didn't know for sure, he stammered. I suspected, but I didn't know. Margaret stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint of the truth. She had always been close to Richard, sharing a bond that transcended the usual sibling rivalry. But now, she saw him in a new light, a stranger, a potential accomplice in a conspiracy that had shattered her world. How long have you suspected? She asked, her voice cold, accusatory. Richard hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. Since the telegram, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The one that said James was buried with the ring. It didn't make sense. I knew how much that ring meant to you. Margaret felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards her brother. He had known, or at least suspected, the truth, and he had kept it from her. He had allowed her to grieve, to mourn, to cling to a lie. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, her voice cracking with emotion. Why did you let me believe? Richard looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. I didn't want to hurt you, he said, his voice trembling. I thought it was better to let you believe the lie. To protect you from the truth. Margaret laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the cemetery. Protect me? She said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You protected me by letting me live a lie? By letting me mourn a man who wasn't who I thought he was? Richard took a step towards her, his hands outstretched, as if pleading for understanding. Margaret, please, he said, his voice desperate. I did what I thought was best. I was afraid of what the truth would do to you. Margaret recoiled from his touch, her heart filled with a mixture of anger and betrayal. The truth, she said, her voice cold, is that you were a coward, Richard. You were afraid to face the consequences of James's actions, of your own silence. The storm raged around them, the wind howling, the rain lashing down, mirroring the tempest of emotions that consumed Margaret. She felt lost, betrayed, adrift in a sea of lies and deception. I saw him, Richard said. I saw James. At Ypres. Margaret, after his confession, was shocked into silence. She did not expect that at all. The ghost of Ypres had been in front of her all along, with a much bigger role. Chapter 14. The Scarred Heart. The words hung in the air, stark and unbelievable, amidst the howling wind and driving rain. Ypres. The name evoked images of mud-soaked trenches, relentless shelling, and unimaginable carnage, a place synonymous with the horrors of the war. You saw James? Margaret repeated, her voice barely a whisper, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of Richard's statement. At Ypres? But he was supposed to be in Amiens. Richard nodded, his face pale and drawn, his eyes haunted by a memory that clearly tormented him. It was a chance encounter, he said, his voice hesitant, as if he were reliving a nightmare. I was with my unit, we were being transferred to a new sector. We passed through Ypres, and I saw him. Standing near a field hospital. Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was a new layer of the mystery, a twist she had not anticipated. James in Ypres, the site of some of the most brutal fighting of the war. What was he doing there? She asked, her voice trembling. Richard hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. I don't know, he stammered. He looked different. Haggard. Haunted. He was wearing a uniform, but it wasn't his usual one. It was plain. Unmarked. Unmarked. The word resonated with Margaret, a chilling echo of the unknown soldier grave. James, shedding his identity, erasing his past, preparing for his final act of disappearance. Did you talk to him? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard shook his head. No. I wanted to, but I couldn't. I was afraid. Afraid of what he might say. Afraid of what it might mean. Margaret understood his fear, the paralyzing terror that had gripped so many soldiers during the war, the fear of confronting the truth, the fear of shattering the fragile illusions that kept them going. So, you just let him go? She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. Richard nodded, his eyes welling with tears. I told myself it wasn't him, he said, his voice choked with emotion. That I was mistaken. That it was just a hallucination. A ghost of the war. But it hadn't been a hallucination. It had been James, preparing for his final act of deception, orchestrating his own disappearance, his escape from the horrors that had consumed him. And you didn't tell anyone? Margaret asked, her voice cold, accusatory. Richard shook his head again.
No.
I kept it to myself. I buried it deep, tried to forget. But I couldn't.
It haunted me.
Every day. Margaret felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards her brother, towards his cowardice, his silence, his complicity in James's deception. But beneath the anger, there was also a flicker of understanding, a recognition of the shared trauma that had scarred them both. It was after I saw him at Ypres, Richard continued, and confessed to Margaret, that I started to suspect he might have a bigger plan to get out of the war. I saw him again, I tell you. It was him. Richard, I need you to tell me something. Did you help James? Richard nodded, knowing that all the lies had to end. I got in the uniform. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dirt and grime, revealing the raw, wounded landscape beneath. Margaret and Richard stood there, in the heart of the cemetery, bound together by a shared past, a shared grief, a shared secret that had finally been revealed. The scarred heart of their family, wounded by war, by lies, by silence, was finally exposed, laid bare under the stormy sky. Chapter 15. Betrayal in the Dark. The confession hung between them, heavy and suffocating, like the damp air of the cemetery. Margaret stared at her brother, her mind reeling, trying to process the enormity of his betrayal. He had helped James. He had been an accomplice in the deception, a participant in the conspiracy that had shattered her world. You got him the uniform? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper, the question a painful echo of the one she had asked Annalise weeks ago, the one she had asked Father O'Connell, the one that had haunted her dreams. Richard nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and shame. It was after Ypres, he said, his voice hesitant, as if he were reliving a painful memory. I received a letter from him. He asked for my help. He said he couldn't go on, that he needed to disappear. Margaret felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards James, towards his manipulation, his selfishness, his disregard for the consequences of his actions. He had used Richard, his own fiancé's brother, to orchestrate his escape, to betray the woman he had supposedly loved. And you just agreed? She asked, her voice cold, accusatory. You didn't question him? You didn't try to stop him? Richard looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. I was confused, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't know what to do. He was desperate, Margaret. He was on the verge of a breakdown. I thought I was helping him. Margaret laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the cemetery. Helping him? She said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You helped him betray me. You helped him fake his own death. You helped him erase his identity. Richard flinched, as if struck by her words. He took a step back, his hands clenching into fists. I know it was wrong, he stammered. But I didn't know what else to do. I was afraid, Margaret. Afraid of what he might do, if I refused. Margaret stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of remorse, any hint of genuine regret. She saw only fear, a deep-seated terror that had driven him to complicity, to silence. How did you get the uniform? She asked, her voice cold, demanding. Richard hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. I had contacts, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. People who could get things. Things that weren't supposed to be available. Margaret understood. The war had created a black market, a shadow economy where anything could be bought and sold, where loyalties were blurred, where morality was a luxury few could afford. And you never told anyone? She asked, her voice trembling. You kept this secret for all these years? Richard nodded, his eyes welling with tears. I wanted to protect you, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I wanted to protect the family. I thought it was better to let the lie stand. Margaret turned away from him, her gaze fixed on the unmarked grave of the unknown soldier. She felt a profound sense of betrayal, a wound that cut deeper than any physical injury. Richard, her brother, the man she had trusted, had been a part of the deception, a silent accomplice in the conspiracy that had stolen her future, her happiness. "It wasn't just about protecting you," she said, and turned back to face him. "It was about protecting the family's reputation, that pristine image, that beautiful facade. It was about covering it all up and avoiding shame. You helped him for you, Richard." The darkness had fallen completely now, the cemetery shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of their breathing, the rustling of the leaves, and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. The betrayal, revealed in the dark, was a stark reminder of the hidden wounds, the unspoken secrets that lay buried beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary lives. Richard reached out to grab Margaret's hand. "I am sorry, Margaret. I truly am. Can you ever forgive me?" Margaret stared at him, looking straight through him. She then took a step back and quietly left and disappeared into the night. Chapter 16. The Unveiling. The days following the confrontation with Richard were a blur. Margaret moved through her life like a ghost, haunted by the revelations in the cemetery, by the betrayal of her brother, by the shattered remnants of her past. She felt isolated, adrift in a sea of grief and uncertainty, unable to connect with the world around her. She avoided Calloway House, unable to face the familiar surroundings, the memories that now seemed tainted by lies and deception. She stayed in a small, anonymous hotel, seeking refuge in the anonymity of the city. She wrestled with the decision of what to do with the information she had uncovered. Should she reveal the truth to her family, to the world? Should she expose James's deception, shatter the illusion of his heroic death? Or should she keep the secret buried, protecting the family's reputation, preserving the memory of the man she had once loved? The weight of the decision pressed down on her, a heavy burden that made even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. She felt torn between her loyalty to James, her love for her family, and her own need for truth and justice. After days of agonizing indecision, Margaret finally made up her mind. She could not live with the lie any longer. She could not perpetuate the deception, protect the guilty, allow the truth to remain buried. She decided to hold a family gathering, a small, intimate affair at Calloway House. She invited her parents, her siblings, and a few close relatives. She knew it would be difficult, painful, but it was necessary. The day of the gathering arrived, and Margaret felt a sense of dread, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She had prepared herself, rehearsed what she would say, but she knew that no amount of preparation could fully shield her from the emotional fallout of her revelations. As her family members arrived, Margaret greeted them with a forced smile, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar faces, the loving embraces, the casual conversations, it all felt like a charade, a facade that was about to crumble. Once everyone had gathered in the parlor, Margaret stood before them, her legs trembling, her hands clasped tightly together. The room was filled with a hushed expectancy, a sense of anticipation that hung heavy in the air. I have something to tell you," she began, her voice hesitant, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her loved ones. "Something difficult. Something that will change the way we see our family and James." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the storm that was about to break. She recounted her journey, her discovery of the letters in the attic, her search for her encounter with Father O'Connell, her discovery of the unknown soldier grave. She told them about James's deception, his double life, his decision to disappear, to fake his own death. She told them about Richard's complicity, his role in helping James obtain the unmarked uniform, his silence for all these years. As she spoke, the room fell silent, the only sound her own voice, trembling with emotion, and the occasional gasp or sob from her family members. Their faces reflected a mixture of shock, disbelief, anger, and grief. When she finished, a heavy silence descended upon the room. The weight of the revelations, the shattered illusions, the broken trust, it was almost unbearable. Her father, a stoic, reserved man, was the first to speak. I don't understand, he said, his voice trembling. Our James, he wouldn't do that. He was a hero. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and compassion. He was a victim, father, she said, her voice soft. A victim of the war, of the horrors he witnessed, of the choices he was forced to make. Her mother, a gentle, loving woman, began to weep, her body shaking with sobs.
My poor boy, she cried.
My poor, lost boy. Richard stood in the corner of the room, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't speak, didn't defend himself. He simply stood there, bearing the weight of his guilt, his shame. The unveiling was complete. The truth, raw and painful, had been revealed. The carefully constructed facade of the Calloway family, the illusion of their perfect past, had been shattered, revealing the hidden wounds, the unspoken secrets that lay beneath. Margaret had brought it all down. It was time to rebuild. Chapter 17. The Weight of Honor. The aftermath of the revelation was a maelstrom of emotions. The Calloway family, once a bastion of stability and tradition, was thrown into turmoil, grappling with the shattered remnants of their past. Accusations flew, tears flowed, and the bonds of family were tested to their limits. Margaret's father, initially in denial, eventually succumbed to the weight of the evidence, his stoicism crumbling under the force of his grief and disappointment. He retreated into himself, becoming withdrawn and distant, unable to reconcile the image of his heroic son with the reality of James's deception. Margaret's mother, overwhelmed by sorrow, clung to Margaret for support, finding solace in their shared loss, their shared understanding of James's brokenness. She wept for her son, for the life he had lost, for the choices he had made. Richard, ostracized by his family, became a pariah, a living embodiment of betrayal and guilt. He attempted to apologize, to explain himself, but his words fell on deaf ears. He was banished from Calloway House, his presence a constant reminder of the pain he had inflicted. Margaret, despite the emotional toll of the unveiling, felt a sense of liberation, a release from the burden of secrets she had carried for so long. She had done what she believed was right, what was necessary, even though it had come at a great cost. She decided to take one final step, a symbolic act of closure and reconciliation. She arranged for a proper headstone to be placed on James's grave, replacing the anonymous cross with a marker that bore his name, his rank, and the dates of his birth and death. She also included a small inscription, a quote from one of James's letters, a passage that had always resonated with her. Honor is not a word, but a weight, a burden to carry, even unto death. The unveiling of the headstone was a small, private ceremony, attended only by Margaret, her mother, and Father O'Connell, who had traveled from Ireland to be there. It was a somber occasion, a final farewell to the man James had been, and a recognition of the man he had become. As they stood before the grave, Margaret felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that had eluded her for so long. She had done everything she could to honor James's memory, to uncover the truth, to bring closure to his story. Father O'Connell offered a prayer, his words a blessing, a plea for forgiveness, a recognition of the enduring power of love in the face of loss and betrayal. He spoke of James's courage, his sacrifice, his struggle to find peace in a world torn apart by war. Margaret's mother placed a bouquet of white roses on the grave, her tears falling silently on the freshly turned earth. She whispered a final goodbye to her son, her voice choked with emotion. Margaret stood in silence, her gaze fixed on the headstone, on James's name, on the inscription that captured the essence of his life, his struggle, his ultimate sacrifice. She felt a sense of closure, a release from the pain that had haunted her for so long. As they left the cemetery, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the landscape. Margaret felt a flicker of hope, a sense of renewal, a belief that even in the darkest of times, healing was possible, that even the most broken hearts could find a way to mend. The weight of honor, the burden James had carried, had been lifted. His secrets were revealed, his truth was known, and his soul, finally, could rest in peace. Margaret knew she now carried a different weight, the weight of moving on. Chapter 18. A flicker of hope. Life, as it inevitably does, began to move forward. The raw, gaping wound left by James's deception and Richard's betrayal slowly started to scab over, the initial shock giving way to a dull, persistent ache. The Callaways, fractured and wounded, began the arduous process of rebuilding, of finding a new normal in the aftermath of the storm. Margaret, though still carrying the weight of the past, found a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced the truth, confronted her demons, and emerged stronger, more resilient. She decided to dedicate herself to helping others, to using her experiences to make a difference in the world. She volunteered at a local hospital, working with veterans, men who had returned from the war scarred and broken, both physically and emotionally. She understood their pain, their trauma, their struggle to adjust to a life that would never be the same. She offered them comfort, compassion, and a listening ear, sharing her own story, her own journey of healing. Her relationship with her parents remained strained, the revelations about James having created a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Her father, still withdrawn and distant, struggled to accept the truth, clinging to the idealized image of his heroic son. Her mother, though supportive of Margaret, was consumed by her own grief, her own sense of loss. Richard remained an outcast, banished from the family, his attempts at reconciliation rebuffed. Margaret, though she had forgiven him in her heart, found it difficult to trust him, to rebuild the bond that had been shattered by his betrayal. He had moved out of state to make a new life for himself. One crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret received a letter from Annalise Dubois. The familiar handwriting, the faint scent of lavender, brought a wave of emotions flooding back. She opened the letter with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her chest. Annalise wrote of her life in Oakhaven, of her work as an herbalist, of her quiet, solitary existence. She wrote of her memories of James, of the love they had shared, of the pain of his loss. She also wrote of her gratitude to Margaret for uncovering the truth, for bringing closure to their shared tragedy. "I have found a measure of peace, Margaret," Annalise wrote. "Thanks to you. I know that James is finally at rest, and that his memory is honored. I will always cherish the time we had together, the love that burned so brightly, even in the darkness of war." At the end of the letter, there was an addendum. "Life finds a way, does it not? I've met a man recently, and a spark has appeared in my life. He's a kind soul, and I think there is a chance for me at last." Margaret smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile that had been absent for far too long. Annalise's words, her resilience, her ability to find hope amidst the ashes of the past, filled her with a renewed sense of optimism. She realized that life, despite its pain, its losses, its betrayals, had a remarkable capacity for renewal, for healing, for offering second chances. She had been through the darkness, she had faced the storm, and she had emerged, scarred but not broken, wounded but not defeated. She had learned that forgiveness was important, and that while the past may be dark, the future did not have to be. The past was set, but the future could be molded. A flicker of hope, a spark of possibility, ignited within her. She looked out the window, at the bustling city below, at the endless stream of humanity, each person carrying their own burdens, their own secrets, their own dreams. She felt a sense of connection, a sense of belonging, a belief that even in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, life, with all its complexities, was worth living. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. Several months after receiving Annalise's letter, Margaret found herself drawn back to Greenwood Cemetery. It was a crisp spring day, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers, the trees bursting with new life. The cemetery, once a place of mourning and loss, now seemed to hold a sense of peace, a quiet beauty that resonated with Margaret's own journey of healing. She walked to James's grave, the headstone now weathered and worn, blending seamlessly into the landscape. She placed a bouquet of white roses, her mother's favorite, on the grave, a silent tribute to the man she had loved, the man who had been lost, the man who had finally found peace. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Margaret?" She turned, her heart skipping a beat. It was Richard. He stood a few feet away, his face etched with a mixture of nervousness and hope. He looked older, more weathered, the lines of guilt and regret etched deeper into his features. "Richard," she said, her voice neutral, devoid of the anger and resentment that had once consumed her. "What are you doing here?" He took a step closer, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I came to see James," he said, his voice hesitant. "And to see you." Margaret remained silent, her gaze fixed on her brother, her emotions a complex mix of sadness, forgiveness, and a lingering sense of betrayal. I know I can never make up for what I did," Richard continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But I wanted to apologize. Again. To tell you how sorry I am. For everything." Margaret nodded, her eyes welling with tears. She had forgiven Richard, in her heart, but the wound he had inflicted was still raw, the scar tissue still tender. "I understand why you did it," she said, her voice soft, compassionate. "You were afraid. You were protecting James. Protecting the family." Richard looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "It wasn't just that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper.
"I admire James."
I looked up to him. I wanted to be like him. When he asked for my help, I couldn't refuse. Margaret understood. The allure of heroism, the desire to be a part of something larger than oneself, the intoxicating power of loyalty, it had all played a role in Richard's decision, in his complicity in James's deception. "I've been living with the guilt, Margaret," Richard continued, his voice choked with emotion. "Every day. It's been a heavy burden to bear." Margaret reached out and took his hand, her grip firm, reassuring. "I know," she said, her voice gentle, "but you don't have to carry it alone anymore. We all make mistakes, Richard. We all do things we regret. The important thing is to learn from them, to grow, to become better people." Richard squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for forgiving me." They stood there, in silence, for a long moment, brother and sister, reunited by grief, by forgiveness, by the shared burden of their past. The reckoning had come, the truth had been faced, and the healing could finally begin. "I've been thinking about what to do," he continued. "I can't change what happened, but I can help others. I have joined an organization that works with soldiers, people who have returned from war with problems." Margaret nodded. It felt right. As they walked away from the grave, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the cemetery. Margaret felt a sense of hope, a belief that even in the aftermath of betrayal and loss, reconciliation was possible, that even the most fractured relationships could find a way to mend. The past would always be a part of them, a scar on their hearts, but it no longer defined them. They had faced the reckoning, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. The future could be changed. Chapter 20. The long road home. Years passed. The wounds of the past, though still present, faded into scars, reminders of the pain endured, the lessons learned, the resilience discovered. Margaret, guided by her experiences, built a life dedicated to service, to helping others navigate the complexities of grief, loss, and the enduring impact of trauma. She continued her work with veterans, finding solace and purpose in supporting those who had returned from war, scarred and broken, struggling to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. She became a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of healing, a living embodiment of the belief that even in the darkest of times, light could be found. Her relationship with her parents gradually healed, the chasm created by James's deception slowly closing, replaced by a fragile, tentative understanding. Her father, though he never fully recovered from the loss of his idealized son, found a measure of peace in Margaret's strength, in her unwavering commitment to honoring James's memory in her own way. Her mother, drawing strength from Margaret's resilience, found solace in their shared grief, in their shared journey of healing. Richard, having made amends for his past actions, became a source of support for Margaret. Their bond, once fractured by betrayal, reforged in the crucible of forgiveness and understanding. He dedicated his life to helping veterans, using his own experiences to guide and support those who were struggling to cope with the invisible wounds of war. He found the peace that had eluded him so long ago. Margaret never married. The ghost of James, the memory of their love, the shadow of his betrayal, always present, a constant reminder of the fragility of happiness, the enduring power of loss. But she found contentment in her work, in her family, in the quiet satisfaction of making a difference in the world. One spring morning, many years after her discovery in the attic, Margaret found herself drawn back to Calloway House. The house, once a symbol of family secrets and hidden pain, now stood as a testament to resilience, to the enduring power of love and forgiveness. She walked through the familiar rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence, the memories flooding back, no longer painful, but bittersweet, tinged with a sense of acceptance and peace. She climbed the stairs to the attic, the place where her journey had begun, the place where she had discovered the truth that had shattered her world and ultimately set her free. The attic was dusty and silent, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. The sunlight streamed through the dormer window, illuminating the swirling motes of dust, dancing like tiny, restless spirits, no longer haunting, but comforting, familiar. She knelt beside the battered wooden chest, the one that had held Eleanor's belongings, the one that had contained the letters, the ring, the unraveling of James's secrets. She opened the chest, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear or anticipation, but with a sense of quiet reverence. The chest was empty, its contents long since sorted, dispersed, given away. But the scent of lavender, Eleanor's favorite, still lingered, a ghostly embrace, a reminder of the woman who had guided her, protected her, even in death. Margaret closed her eyes, drawing a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure, a profound sense of peace. She had come full circle. Her journey had led her back to the beginning, but she was no longer the same person she had been. She had faced the darkness, she had embraced the truth, and she had emerged, stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. The long road home had been arduous, filled with pain, loss, and betrayal. But it had also been a journey of self-discovery, of healing, of forgiveness, and ultimately, of redemption. She had found her way back to herself, to her family, to a life filled with purpose and meaning. The weight of the past, the burden of secrets, had been lifted, and she was finally free. She stood up and opened the window. She was home. Epilogue. The sun set over Brooklyn, casting long shadows across the familiar streets, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and a soft, fading rose. Margaret stood on the porch of Calloway House, watching the day surrender to night, feeling the gentle breeze on her face, the scent of blooming lilacs in the air. She was an old woman now, her hair silvered, her face lined with the passage of time, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of experiences, of joys and sorrows, of losses and triumphs. She had lived a full life, a life dedicated to service, to healing, to making a difference in the world. The echoes of the past, the whispers of James, of Eleanor, of Annalise, of Richard, still lingered, but they no longer haunted her. They were a part of her, woven into the fabric of her being, but they no longer defined her. She had made peace with her past, she had forgiven those who had wronged her, and she had found a measure of contentment in the quiet solitude of her later years. Calloway House, once a repository of secrets and hidden pain, now stood as a symbol of resilience, of the enduring power of family, of the healing balm of time. It was a place of refuge, a sanctuary, a reminder of the journey she had undertaken, the lessons she had learned, the love that had sustained her. As she stood there, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret felt a sense of gratitude, a profound appreciation for the life she had lived, for the challenges she had overcome, for the love she had known, even in its most flawed and imperfect forms. She had found her way back home, not just to Calloway House, but to herself, to a place of inner peace, of acceptance, of quiet joy. She had navigated the long road of grief and betrayal, of loss and forgiveness, and she had emerged, whole, complete, her spirit unbroken. The world had changed dramatically since the days of the Great War, since the discovery in the attic that had shattered her illusions and set her on a path of self-discovery. But some things remained constant: the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for healing and renewal. Margaret smiled, a gentle, knowing smile, a smile that reflected a lifetime of wisdom, of compassion, of understanding. She had lived, she had loved, she had lost, and she had found her way back to the light. She turned and went inside, closing the door behind her, leaving the night to its quiet mysteries, her heart filled with a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that even in the face of death, life, in all its beautiful, heartbreaking complexity, would endure. She walked up the stairs and slept.